Hello everyone. So I'm Mundi, CEO of Klang Games. We're based in Berlin. We've been working on a game called Seed for about 2 years now, but it's a very old idea. So my two co-founders come from a studio called CCP, and that studio built a game called Eve. And Eve I'll get into that. But so what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of where we see multiplayer games headed, and we want to kind of start off with a bit of a logic behind that. And so if we look at kind of level 1 of multiplayer games, there was actually the first game ever created called Tennis for Two, and that was a 2-player game. So the first game ever was a multiplayer game. And then quickly after there followed some interesting other multiplayer games. But these games mainly focused on 2 players, but this kind of genre, I would say, has created a whole vocabulary of games today. Here's just some examples. Because the player amount here is quite low, there's an insane amount of games that exist in the kind of 2-player genre. Obviously, then level 2 would be a multiplayer genre, and the first games came fairly quickly after. These are like networked games. So these games were very early on, but still worked over network and had around 32 players or a little bit more. And this also has created a big genre and has kind of included some of the most popular games of today's era. But obviously it's a much smaller genre than the 2-player genre. And so if we continue on that trend, the games that come next would be massive multiplayer. These are the first ones there. And again, like a much rarer game, or like fewer games have been created in the massive multiplayer genre. Here are some examples which we're all familiar with. But again, these are massive multiplayer games. There's not many of them, but they are some of them quite successful. We obviously consider them to be the future of multiplayer gaming with more connectivity. But then what would come after? And there has not been done much in what comes after, and actually it's quite funny because the name is currently Single Shared Massive Multiplayer Online Games. This is probably a pretty hectic name. So if anybody has any ideas for another name for this genre, then please let me know. But Eve is kind of the only game worth mentioning in this genre. There are some other examples like Albion Online and some browser games, but Eve is the one that has kind of shined by actually bringing all of the players into the same world. And that adds, of course, a lot of complexity. The game we are making is definitely going to be in this similar genre, and there's a lot of kind of back-end technology being built now. We're building it on Improbable, which is probably something you are familiar with. And what they do is basically connect all the servers into one kind of cloud cluster, and therefore allow for everybody basically to be in the same world. Much like you imagine a social network, for example. In a social network, you don't think, what shard am I on? And so this it requires quite a different approach. And my focus here on the talk today is kind of what are the design challenges and what have we been thinking through to answer some of the questions. Because this genre will definitely happen. There's Amazon is investing in it. I know a couple of others that have started building this kind of back-end technology. And we are working with Improbable, which has got the big $500 million investment from SoftBank just last year. And so I think, the first thing people think about when they think about, oh yeah, it's going to be like World of Warcraft with more players. And I would argue that that's not really the case, and that's why I also want to bring up Eve, because Eve has some of the kind of fundamental designs that make a world like this possible, which I'll go through. Okay, so looking at kind of starting with just what are I would say the basic design challenges that come with trying to bring everybody into a single world. So games are usually very reliant on authored narrative, and like the genre before, massive multiplayer relies quite heavily on that. So in World of Warcraft, which is a massive multiplayer, you might think, obviously massive multiplayers are the most social gaming experience you'll find, but very often it tends not to be like that, and players are kind of finding themselves doing, missions with their 2 other friends, maybe down some dungeon that's pre-authored by the studio. And this works when you have like maybe 10,000 players in a single world. 10% of them are going to be online at the same time, so the world can kind of handle that amount and create enough content for them not to, feel like they are dime a dozen. But in a world where you have maybe 500,000 players or 10 million players going forward, then that dungeon there is probably going to be full of people if everybody's living in the same on the same shard. And so authored narrative tends to be quite difficult, and we'll get to some solutions for that in a bit. Another thing that's obviously very classic in games are leaderboards, and being number 468,972 on a leaderboard doesn't really mean much. But so leaderboards also become pretty useless. So you cannot rely on these kind of designs for these cloud-based MMOs, I would argue. And this permanent progression that we're classically seeing in MMOs tends to divide players. So if you join World of Warcraft today and you haven't been playing that since the beginning, you're most likely going to be lagging that far behind that there's this infinitely large divide from you to the veteran players. And that's a problem because obviously these games are meant for a very long lifetime. And finally, how are players going to feel special in a world where, you're just on kind of, with everybody that's playing the game, how are you going to feel like you are actually contributing or being a part of it and not just kind of an ant in an ant farm? So these are what I would kind of say are some of the main challenges. Of course, there's a whole bunch of technical issues as well, but I'm not going to go into that because I'm not an engineer. So look for other talks for that. And so here come the kind of what design approaches you need to take into account when building a game like this. So obviously persistence is very important, so that the whole world will not change so drastically depending on whether players are actually online or offline. And building a game like this requires a lot of emergence, so that the world is actually kind of being created by the game itself. Other than, on the other, it's kind of on the other side of authored content. What is the content that kind of gets created just because there are so many players in the sandcastle or sandbox? And then, a single world where everything takes place in obviously requires the 2 above. If I would come in online when and things have changed because I wasn't online or something like that, that would have negative impact on my experience. Emergence, because you can never author content for a vast world to give players. And another part that follows the emergent point is that when these MMOs are being done today, they have an inherent problem which follows the fact that studios are trying to continuously try to create content for this persistent audience who is basically ready to play there every day, but the update only comes out every 3 months, and therefore, the update is then completed. The players will finish the new content in about 3 days max, and then they have to wait another 3 months for more content. And so emergent content is obviously much better if the players are kind of a part of the problem and creating the content. Okay, so for us, at least at Klang, the design goals revolve around, how can we make this experience very relevant and purpose-driven for the user, so they don't feel like they're either on a roller coaster or just doing something completely pointless, but that they're adding to the emergent part of the game. So by thinking about each player actually adds to the experience, how can that work? How can a player, more players make it more fun? Because a lot of the games that are actually being proposed now, which I'm not that excited about, is, for example, taking a classic game model, like a normal multiplayer game, and just throwing more players into it, because the game experience necessarily doesn't get better by just throwing more players into a classic game mode. So you have to think about in a different way where like what game modes or what kind of game actually gets better with adding more players. And that's a very fundamental thing. Social fulfillment is a unique opportunity of this platform. I mean, if you would compare this to a social network, and you compare like Facebook to World of Warcraft, and like every time you log offline in a normal massive multiplayer or any multiplayer, your existence is completely removed, your character's not there anymore. You might have built a house, that house is now empty with no life in it. And so it's creating like if you compare that to Facebook, and if you would log offline and they would like remove your profile and take everything that you have ever done on Facebook away while you're not actively using it, that would be like sending us back to like IRC days or MSN. And so, why would Facebook not work like that? That's a very obvious thing. Now when you use Facebook or any other social network or even any messaging service, you don't even think about whether the user is actually there actively using it when you send them a message or interact with them in any way. But that's how games are, right? So you're actually completely removed from the experience. So think about a way to come up with persistence that allows the experience and the progress of the user to be very present, whether he's actually actively playing or not. And another goal here is that this type of games are going to be 10 times more expensive to produce than normal games. So these aren't going to be games that you have number 1 and 2 of. These are going to be persistently in development over decades. So you have to think about extreme lifetime where you're getting users onto a path which can lead them playing into the rest of their lives. So there are some known solutions. I think taking from Eve, we have seen a very dynamic driven player economy, or player-driven economy, sorry, and that is a mechanic that has worked wonderfully, because adding more players into the economy of Eve actually makes it more dynamic and more exciting, and you can get more opportunities within a system like that. So fully player-driven economy is quite complex, but that's a typical feature which you might want to focus on for next-gen multiplayer like this. And then you want to have a lot of creative tools to have players group together and find how they can build huge guilds or whatever it's called. In EVE it's called corporations. In Seed we're actually just calling it governments or countries. And so you want to give them tools to allow to build insane hierarchies that allow players to build out problems and kind of trickle down their issues down to other players who are maybe lower in the ranks. So that flow of missions or whatever content that you want the players to build can easily stream to the entire player community. And then of course you need fantastic communication tools for players to talk to each other in game, which is kind of a given one. And for us at Seed, obviously EVE is now 15 years old, so we want to take some of these things even further. And for us, some of the proposed solutions is basically have almost everything is player created. Like what we do at Klang is just to let the players into this vastly open playing field, but give them an endless amount of tools to build out things that will ultimately bring problems for other players and bring more content into the world. And so player created stuff is hugely important for the genre. More persistence. In Seed, we will actually leave your existence in the game. So in Seed, you will have a family of characters that lives in the game, whether you're playing or not. So they're driven a bit by AI, similar to The Sims, I guess. And they will remain in the game, whether you're playing or not. And so, for example, if you have a 100-player community and normal kind of online activity is around 10%. So in a 100-player community in a normal MMO, you'll have 10 players walking around in a ghost town if they've created that town themselves. But if you would give them a number of characters each that persist in the game, you would now maybe have a 100-player community, but you have 1,000 persistent characters that live and create that vibrance that you might be familiar with in these kind of open social networks. And then hugely important is also that you have mobile support, because if you have this insane persistence, then you need players to be able to interact with it on the go, and this is something that is completely lacking in the MMO space today. You have no way of sending a message to a user that is online, which is ridiculous, because you want that continuous engagement with this very persistent living world. And ultimately, at least for us, we solely believe this will have a much more meaningful experience where you feel your actions will matter to the world, like everything you do actually impacts it and changes the experience. Like every butterfly effect will be trailing off into this insane, complex simulation, and ultimately, be a much more meaningful experience, moving up from less connectivity to more connectivity. Yeah, any questions?
Hey, thanks for the interesting presentation. One question I have is, you showed that emergent gameplay is a big pillar for what you're looking at, which is quite true.
Yeah.
But then you also mentioned player-controlled economy. And what I've experienced is, in my own design tenure, like it leads, even if it's not player control, the economies tend to inflate over time. And if you're talking about player-driven economy, you're talking about trading, black markets, but that is also underground economy is also part of emergent gameplay. So in a way, they're contradicting. How would you balance it? Would you police the inflation in underground economy? Yeah.
I mean, you definitely need some policing, at least to begin with, until it reaches a certain scale or stability. Mm-hmm. So I think for us, we will have an NPC that kind of buys and sells goods to kind of keep down or up prices of certain goods. But ultimately, those prices should be kind of become redundant over time, because it should be the least of your options. Mm-hmm. So you move towards doing more player kind of driven transactions. If the NPC is always buying wood for really shitty price, then slowly you'll start finding more and more players who are buying it for more price, and therefore ultimately the NPC becomes more and more redundant, and the economy is kind of rolling in of itself.
Cool.
So,
thanks.
Yeah.
Anybody else? We've got a couple of minutes. Excellent. I'll just dash through. We might have to collaborate. Can someone pass that man this mic? He got them the wrong way, man.
So, in your examples, you talk about 10 players, 100 players, 1,000 players. Have you thought about how this is really going to scale? I mean, if you have 1,000 players in your game, it's probably not a very successful game. So how have you thought about, from a design perspective, millions of players?
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole topic.
Which I assume is the goal, right?
Yeah, no, I tried to say earlier, like, this is, like, how do we go from, like, yeah, exactly, like, a normal MMO's experience has, maybe 10,000 per shard, and then 2,000 of them are maybe online at the very peak. No, these games are going to have everybody in the same game. So, yeah, I'm solely talking about games with hundreds of thousands of players in the same world. That's why, like, all these challenges are proposed.